And our guest, the very special Yousef, who brought death and destruction to the autistic libertarians and the capitalist shills on Steven Crowder's Change My Mind special. So he'll be joining us in a moment. So let's bring him on the show right now. I'm going to call him up on Skype right now, and we'll pull him up here, the great Yousef. And let me give him a ring right now on the old Skype. I know everybody's been waiting all week. And there he is, the man himself, the man of the hour, Mr. Yousef. How are you doing?
Thanks.
Excellent. Let me just pull you up on the screen here, and we can get started. Everybody's been dying to have you on the show because we all saw the eternal blowing out of Mr. Steven Crowder, and we appreciate your service to the Nazbowl Nation. So let me bring you up here. There we go. All right, so let me just peep that on. Okay, so we're looking good. All right, so Mr. Yousef, for starters, let's just have a little introduction. We talked a little bit before the show, but I wanted to save the conversation for now, so it'd be a little bit more organic. So just tell us who you are, what you're about, where you go to school, all of that good stuff. Who is Yousef?
So I'm a computer science major at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I would say that my politics are probably conservative and progressive a little bit. You know, I think that progressive politics is the right way forward for this country in terms of, you know, raising wages for the working class, but that I think the Democrats have gone in the wrong direction with respect to encouraging mass immigration and especially illegal immigration. I think that it's actually harming the working class. And so we can, I know the conservatives, that's something the conservatives are concerned about. So there can be some, I think there could be a coalition forming in that direction.
Absolutely, and it's funny you say that because I didn't quite peg you as a progressive. I know you said earlier you would describe yourself as a based progressive, and I think that's whoops. Hang on. All right, I just got an alert from Skype, but I think it's a little bit interesting that you describe yourself as a progressive because this is something I think a lot of people on the right have been talking about for a long time since the Trump election, which is that overlap between the far right and people on the left who want to help out the working class, where those interests converge. And the reason we're having you on, of course, is because you went toe-to-toe with Mr. Steven Crowder on the question of socialism. And I think there are those critiques from both the left and the right of where capitalism falls short of both of our goals. And so could you tell us a little bit about your encounter with Steven Crowder for people that maybe didn't see the whole thing? Could you give us a little refresher on what exactly that was all about from your perspective?
Yeah, so Steven Crowder has a series called Change My Mind, where he puts up a statement on a banner. And so in that one, it was socialism is evil. And the premise of that is that people are going to come from the audience that disagree with him and are going to argue with him to try to change his mind. Now, what people were talking about in the debate was that he wasn't necessarily really open to having his mind changed, and there were all sorts of debate tactics like, you know, taking away the mic and, you know, and not allowing me to finish my points that seemed to indicate that it was not so much about changing his mind as about demonstrating to his audience that his preconceived views are correct. And so I think most people who watched the video were able to see that was the case, and it seemed like in the comment section at least people were siding with me. So thought it went well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, because I watched it. You know, it was sent over to me by a friend, and I was like, okay, let's see what this is about. And before I even finished it, I watched it in the comments. All the top comments were, you know, Steven Crowder, I'm a fan of yours, or Steven Crowder, I like you a lot. But that first guy that you debated, it seems like you went away. And I got to say, I have to hand it to you. I have to hand you a little bit of respect because for me to watch you sit there and calm and respectfully rebut his points, despite, like you said, yanking the microphone away. And I could see several times getting in your personal space, getting right up in there, pandering to the crowd the whole time. I mean, that was, aside from even the debate, the most striking thing to me was just how rude he was, right? I mean, he kept saying to you, you know, this is a debate. It's one-on-one. We're not playing to the audience. And then how many times did he turn to the audience after he made a joke? So I admire that you were able to contain yourself. And so what was the point that you were trying to make? I know he accused you of speaking in paragraphs. If you could summarize, what was your rebuttal to his argument that socialism was evil?
It was mostly a pragmatic argument. And the point I was trying to make was that if you're a conservative, and you're concerned about mass immigration and particularly illegal immigration, it's impossible to miss the fact that the dynamics that are driving this illegal immigration to the United States is a desire by certain employers to get lower wage workers than the kind of workers they have here. I like to say that illegal immigration is sort of the counterpart of outsourcing. Companies that want to get cheaper labor, they can either outsource their factories or they can bring cheaper third world workers into the United States. But it's fundamentally the same dynamic. And the people that are the big losers at the end of the day, economically speaking, are the working class. So if you're a conservative and you're opposed to this sort of mass immigration, illegal immigration trend, you should be siding with the working class and adopting more pro-working class politics.
Exactly, yeah, and I think that's fair. And I know a lot of my viewers lean very heavily conservative. It's kind of a split. Some people are, I think, of very similar mind to you in that they're not ideologically conservative. And then I think the other half would be your more traditional Reagan-type conservative. And a lot of people said, this guy's a socialist. What's going on, Nick? Are you a socialist? And I would say, I think that's a valid critique. Whatever your thoughts are about the broader system, I think what you present to that conversation of this like normie idea of, capitalism is everything, the capitalism and the free market, that's the hill to die on. I think regardless of the broader ideology, you present an extremely valid critique of capitalism in the 21st century, which is that from both sides, we want to see the working class do well, we want the people of the country to do well, and either from a demographic or a cultural angle or just plain economic, immigration really does harm that. And so you came there, you really challenged him. It was great to see him kind of backpedaling, and it was clear that he didn't want to change his mind, which is unfortunate. And so you say you're a progressive. Does that mean that would you call yourself mostly a left-wing person, or is it just on that economic issue?
I think that we can distinguish between two aspects of the right, on the left. Just like the right is really a coalition in the sense that you have neocons, you have Christian conservatives, you've got capitalists who don't necessarily have to agree on all the issues, but simply come together out of political convenience. On the left, we have this coalition between your corporate Democrats like Hillary Clinton, SJWs as are referred to on the internet, and the old working class of the Democratic Party. And these are not necessarily the same thing. So I think when people use the term progressive, they sort of lump all these groups in the same label. But in fact, when you look at some of the old progressive activist or working class activists of the past, people like Cesar Chavez, who was an organizer of farm workers in California and other states, and he was saying, look, illegal immigration is harming farm workers in this country. They're like scabs crossing the picket line at a union strike. They're lowering wages. As recently as 2016, Bernie Sanders, in an interview with Ezra Klein, said that Ezra Klein was proposing open borders, so he's more of the corporate Democrat type. And Bernie's like, well, wait a minute, that's a Koch brothers policy. You would completely destroy the working class if you just allowed, a billion immigrants to come in and had completely open borders. It would be terrible. So I do think there is a core of the progressive movement, the working class Democrats, that could be peeled away from the left if conservatives were speaking to them in a way that was more to their liking. But to do that, I think they would have to drop this emphasis on 100% capitalism. And my point is, conservatives should drop capitalism because, everywhere we see now, conservatives aren't really benefiting from the domination of big business. I mean, just look at the controversy over social media and censorship and that sort of thing. It really doesn't work for conservatives now to take the 100% capitalist position.
Yeah, no, 100%. And that's something we've been talking about on the show for a long time, which is that if conservatives dropped that GDP worship, dropped the free market capitalism, that ideological worship of that, and they appealed to working class Democrats, white working class Democrats, or even any, I think, working class Democrats. I think that's one of the ways that you could salvage a state like Texas electorally, is with an economic nationalist message. I think Hispanics, blacks, I think a lot of people would be on board with that because like you said, capitalism doesn't benefit, or at least the free trade, international finance kind of capitalism we've had for 25 years just simply doesn't benefit the vast majority of the electorate. And I think that's something that Trump did very successfully. I think many conservatives, Reagan worshipers, and even some Bernie people said that this is one of the things that Trump did well. You know, the way that he appealed to the working class by going after free trade, going after NAFTA, the TPP, talking about healthcare, for example, where Rand Paul, I think in the second or first presidential debate, said, oh, you're for socialized healthcare. You said you take care of everybody, which is not typical Republican orthodoxy. And I wanted to get your thoughts on Trump, because I think Trump represents kind of this proto-workers' party for the Republican Party. He's not all the way there, but I think he kind of introduced the idea. Can I ask, did you vote for Trump? What were your thoughts on him in the election?
I definitely supported Trump. I would say that I think that he fell short of a number of his promises. You know, you did mention that he was talking about giving health care to everybody, and that's true. But unfortunately, he spent the first half of his first term completely going along with the Paul Ryan agenda. I mean, he gave a big tax cut to the billionaire class, so people like George Soros got a big tax cut. The average Trump voter probably does not get a very large tax cut, and those tax cuts obviously will expire, not for the upper class, but for the middle class. And and also he pushed that healthcare bill. But what he didn't do was push aggressively on immigration. I mean, there were various bills that were being introduced, like the RAISE Act, which was talking about reducing legal immigration by about 50%, and changing the focus of legal immigration from unskilled workers to skilled workers. That's something that would have benefited the working class, but he didn't spend nearly as much energy and attention and time pushing that as he did some of the more capitalistic priorities of people like Paul Ryan. So I think that Trump maybe got duped or fooled by his party into thinking that, if he gave them their priorities, they would give him his priorities, and they obviously haven't.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's a fair critique. And I think a lot of people on this show, a lot of people have said that. The fact that we used, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but there is a very specific rule in the Senate, the Budget Reconciliation Act, where the rule is one bill per year, you can pass it with a simple majority in the Senate, as opposed to a two-thirds majority. And we spent that one time that we had, our one-off rule on that, to get tax cuts instead of the wall, instead of immigration. And just give me 1 sec. I'm hearing from my producer that we have a little bit of an echo, so let me take care of that real quick. Okay, I think that solves it for now. So the echo went away. But yeah, back to the point. That's I think that's been the battle between what we call the white pillars and the black pillars on Trump, is people who say, and I think it's always a fair critique, that we did go too hard on the capitalistic type stuff, maybe in a bid to get Koch brother money, Sheldon Adelson money for the midterms, but that it has been seen as a failure or maybe a betrayal of those more promising things that he was talking about during the election. And so now tell me, so we've covered, I think, this idea of the left and right alliance, because it is coming along. As a progressive, do you have left-wing friends? Do you have left-wing family? What do you think is like the viability for that coalition? Because we hear stories about individuals like yourself who obviously have read about this kind of thing, who think a lot about politics, but I think people are not really seeing it materialize in big numbers of left-wing people coming over. Is it not visible? Is it there? I mean, to what extent do you see this happening in the country?
Well, I would say that when you look at typical Bernie voters, and especially people that are very entrenched in that movement, there is an enormous frustration with the state of the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democrat, if people think the Republican Party is corrupt, the Democratic Party is beyond corrupt. They have the super delegates, so they literally give insiders more votes than ordinary people. And there was a clear attempt by the DNC to undermine the viability of basically the election campaign of Bernie Sanders. So I do think there is a very substantial element of Bernie voters that could be persuaded to vote for Trump. But the key thing to understand is that I think that they are more into the economic message than the identity politics. Hillary Clinton was the big promoter of identity politics. She was the one talking about, racial justice and that sort of thing. And Bernie was taking a much more economic approach. So, I think that, when you look at this phenomenon of, former Obama voters that vote twice for Obama going to Trump, the economic message really does influence a lot of people. And if you can also hit those points about, anti-war and, anti the big banks, for example, and, giving people access to affordable healthcare, I think a lot of people would be persuadable. But in order to do that, there would have to be a fundamental shift within the Republican Party away from this constant appeasement of corporate and capitalistic interests.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's a fair point, because you look at the Democrats, even in some of these primaries leading up to 2018, and there is a lot of dissatisfaction among progressives in the party. And that's something I think Republicans may not be so cognizant of. I mean, we hear about blue wave, we hear about Democratic solidarity, and really, for example, in the Texas primary, you saw in some of those races between the Democrats themselves, there's just an outright civil war between the far left people who are there on the issues and the corporate Democratic Party. And I look at the state of the Republican Party today, and I look at who they appeal to in their platform, in their optics, in their messaging, and they're appealing to the white, Christian, conservative, in some degree Southern, like evangelical voters. And you look at the numbers of people in the country, and that core just is not enough to keep the Republican Party viable in national elections anymore. You know, you think about 2020 or 2024, if somebody like Trump isn't running, if it was Ted Cruz, you're not going to be able to compete in the Midwest. You're not going to be able to compete in the Rust Belt. Sooner or later, you're not going to be able to compete in the Southwest or in the Southeast. And so I think that's really the only way that we can compete with the Democrats in the short term, even the long term, is to peel away those progressives. And then I would ask, I guess, the secondary question, because I'm a very strong Christian. We're very strong cultural conservatives on the show. What do you think is maybe the viability of a party that is culturally conservative? Do you think that, you know, maybe we bring in affordable health care, we bring in anti-war, we bring in maybe the more progressive economics? Do you think that would be enough? Or do you think that the cultural conservatism, would that hurt our chances with the Democrats? To what extent does that affect the viability of bringing them over, in your mind?
I do think there is a divide on cultural issues, and that's not something that's going to go away in one election cycle. In my personal opinion, I think that emphasizing the economic message would be the best way to go forward, and not just an economic message, but, you know, what I hear on shows like this is, you know, this constant critique of, you know, the war in Syria and the sort of pro-Israel foreign policy. It's like, yeah, you know, I think there are a lot of left-wing voters that see things exactly the same way. You know, they might not identify the exact cause. They might say, oh, it's because of oil, it's because of the military-industrial complex. But regardless, there is that sort of consensus of like, this is bad. And so I do think that there are certain kinds of messages that can unite these different coalitions. I don't think that cultural conservatism is necessarily one of those messages, but, you know, like all political coalitions, you know, the different factions in a party are not going to agree on everything. And so it's more about finding those issues that people can agree on enough to overlook the disagreements.
Yeah, that's a great point about coalitions, because I think too often you get people who they have one view of the world and they think that we've just got to get that group of people to be the biggest, as opposed to working with people that are parallel, that are alongside, that agree on certain issues. And that's, I think, the best way to do it, is to set priorities, is to say, you know, look, Democrats, or look, progressives or Green Party people. And then this is something even Richard Spencer talks about. You know, when I saw him at CPAC, and we talked about this as well, who many people consider him extreme far right. I wouldn't say he's classically more conservative than many people in this country, but he himself said, I think we're seeing a lot of people come around on the left as well, you know, in a weird kind of inversion of horseshoe theory. You know, we hate horseshoe theory, but it kind of does work in this case, where we are seeing these two parts come together. And I think that's where the future is in the country, where we will trace the new fault line is not between, you know, the old school boomer conservatives and boomer lefties, but between the corporate coastal elites and the more populist, grassroots, working class type people. And I think you're right on the money about that. So there's that. And then I wanted to ask you, because we've covered the base on the left, but I got to ask you, you're a more personal question. You're a computer science major. Is politics like a hobby for you? Are you heavily invested, or did you confront Steven Crowder just as like a concerned citizen? Like explain why you're into politics.
Yeah, it's mostly just a hobby for me. It's not something that I do regularly or for a living or anything like that. I don't have a YouTube channel. But yeah, I mean, I decided to confront Crowder because I just felt that his version of conservatism was frankly not good for the country and not even good for most conservatives. You know, so yeah, I want to get back to a point you made earlier. You were talking about the cultural conservative issue. And, you know, I just realized, you know, in the 1950s, for example, which most cultural conservatives will point to as being this golden age of conservative values, you know, people forget, like, the top marginal tax rate on incomes was over 90%. this phenomenon of like you have one man taking care of the entire family and having a wife that stays at home and lots of kids, that's very financially expensive. And we're seeing statistics now with like millennials are buying homes at a later time and are having fewer kids and all these sort of cultural trends that are being driven, at least in part, by the growing inequality between the working class and the upper class. So I wouldn't even think that, conservatism is necessarily a liability. It could even be a justification for a lot of these more progressive policies of giving workers a greater ability to live that traditional lifestyle.
Yeah, well, and that's certainly where I came from on criticizing the free market system. People always tell me when I posit a more of a distributist lens on economics or something that is more geared towards the social good as opposed to an economic good, people will always tell me, well, you just haven't read enough Milton Friedman. You just haven't read enough Thomas Sowell. And it's like been there, done that. I was the biggest free market shill that you had ever met when I was in high school. And then I came around to understanding, well, my values really are the public good. And you said in that debate, you said you define evil as bad for society. And I think I came around, as opposed to that individualist lens, to a conception of the society as we need to support families, we need to support people, and maybe that comes at the cost of economic efficiency. And I don't know if I necessarily call myself a socialist. I don't think, people might call you a socialist, but they think Soviet Union, they think Venezuela, like you said in the debate, but maybe we're just looking at something that's like a social democracy. Maybe you have a market economy, but you have certain government or public programs that are there, or some kind of a public consciousness in government that you want to support this kind of a society. And maybe it has to come at the cost of economic efficiency. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I use the term socialism just because on the right, it's become a catch-all for any kind of program that benefits the social good. So obviously, I'm not defending Soviet-style central economic planning, but I use the term socialism partly to trigger Crowder and his fans, and partly to emphasize that yes, there is a role for government in promoting the social good, and if you think that promoting social good is this great evil thing, and we're going to call it socialism is terrible, then I'm going to use the word socialism and say that I'm for it, and argue why we should support it. So it's not so much the word and the words and the semantics that really matter to me. It's about the ideas at the end of the day.
I like that. I like that a lot, because that's actually a really great answer, because I think a lot of people would say, and a lot of people have said, that's probably not the best way to go about it, because socialism is a dirty word. And you know how much money is poured in by these major corporations into Turning Point USA, into Young Americans for Liberty, to make socialism the catch-all, like you said, for centralized government planning. You're for, and I've even heard this when I went to CPAC, I've heard this from a Cato Institute scholar who said, and he told, this is not even a joke, he said that if we wanted to institute immigration quotas or limitations on immigration, he said that was a Soviet-style restriction. I mean, can you believe this? Any way that we could impede the flow of capital into the coffers of Wall Street, it's all socialism. So I actually admire, that's a good point. There is an effectiveness in that you call it socialism, and it does get a reaction. It does, as you say, it triggers them, and then you get to introduce that nuance. So that's really, I think, a great point. That's something I think that is counterintuitive. And would you describe yourself as Nazbol? Have you ever heard of Nazbol?
I've heard of that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I would not align myself with that movement. I believe it's a Russian political party.
Right. Yeah, but it's also kind of just this meme that we have online, just to trigger the Charlie Kirks, the diaper wearing people of the world. And then I would ask the final frontier here, which I'm sure people are dying to wonder. You lean this way in economics, and you say that if you want to support conservative ends culturally and otherwise, you would support these progressive economic measures. What is your take on social issues? Not any particular one, but are you left-wing across the board, or is it just economics? Like, what would you say about society, or just in general?
I'm definitely more on the socially conservative side of issues. Culturally speaking, I think that the decline of religion and religious values and that sort of thing have been a negative to society. So I'm not a classic leftist in that sense. I am conservative, and I believe in some form of economic socialism.
Wow. Well, there you have. I think that's the position for the future. And it's funny because we've seen the rise of this meme, which is, I'm socially liberal and fiscally conservative. You hear this all the time. This is the consensus basically among, young people, young hedonists, who it's like they want to smoke pot and have sex, and they also don't want to pay taxes, and they don't want the corporations to do their thinking for them on economics. And I think the answer to that in many ways could be described as socially conservative, fiscally liberal, which people think is counterintuitive, but even you reference the 1950s where they had a high marginal tax rate and they had conservative family values. I think back in the day, that was the case for the Democrats. That was the case for the left. You know, they weren't outside of the Frankfurt School and the commies. The left was generally saying, you know, we don't want to rip apart the family and you know, have Miley Cyrus smoking pot on MTV. We just want to have a fair distribution of wealth, you know, like Huey Long or Franklin Roosevelt. So I think that's a really great point. And do you have time for questions? Do you have a little bit of time to take questions from the audience?
Sure.
All right. Well, let me peep on over into our super chat and we'll see if we got any questions. Looks like no questions on the super chat, so I'll have to jump into the live chat and we'll see what people are saying. Maybe we'll get some super chats as we're looking in the live chat, because I know the last time I had JF on and people were asking questions after he had left. I was like, I can't ask him the questions because he went away. So let's see what people are asking about. So people are, I think, very supportive of this. They're saying, yes, this is the future. People are saying it's National Socialism. Would you respond to that, though? Would you call yourself a National Socialist, or are you... I know that's kind of a loaded phrase, but...
I would say that that particular movement is a historical movement in a particular country at a particular time. And so I would say that, you know, the views that I'm representing are, in a sense, a form of right-wing socialism, which has a long history, actually. Otto von Bismarck could be characterized as a right-wing socialist. I know some Tories back in the 19th century had some more, like One Nation conservatism, for example, was a right-wing socialist movement. So there are plenty of examples of this. It's not restricted to Germany.
That's a great answer. Who is this guy? Who is this guy? Is Yousef your real name? Are you a Fed? Because that is the perfect answer for that kind of a question. Because, you know, I get asked that all the time, and that's usually the response to the LARPers. Even maybe you're reading certain publications where, you know, they say that, which is right. I mean, that's right on the money. So that's a great answer. But let's jump back in and find some more questions for you. We'll see what people are saying. People are talking about Evola. People are talking about Tories. Somebody asked, what do you think about the Second Amendment?
I think it's essential. You know, I think that the Second Amendment, or at least the push to take it away, is really a power move by the government to disarm and disempower citizens. And it's really not going to help, because we see what's happening in London right now. I believe the crime rate with knives is higher than the violence in New York City. So it's really not helping.
Wow. Well, there you have it. So you're good on guns, you're good on economics, you're good on culture. So you're checking all the boxes here. My audience is going to love you. We're fitting right in here on the America First show. Somebody says, what's your opinion on JFK? What do you think about Jack Kennedy?
I don't have too much of an opinion on him. I think he was overall a good president. I certainly like the Apollo project that he started. You know, there was a time when we did all these heroic things. You know, we built the Hoover Dam, we did the Manhattan Project, we did the Apollo Project. We don't really do things like that anymore as a country. You know, we've sort of sunk into this civilizational malaise. You know, I'd like to see another JFK type of figure, you know, sending us to Mars. You know, let's cure cancer, let's do some amazing things. You know, we can be great again. Wow.
This guy, where was this guy when I had America First Media? We were looking for talent, right? This is great. So I happen to agree. I happen to have like the same view on that. You're right. And that does strike, I think, a very nationalist tone, right? I mean, this idea of doing these great projects, and not necessarily for those ends in themselves, but about pointing the country in a direction towards a goal, rallying behind something, whatever it is, science, disease, war, you know what, or not war, but, you know, something great. So I hear you. Jack Kennedy, you know, I like him for the same reason. People are asking, what's your ethnic background? Do you mind answering that? Is that intrusive?
That's all right. I'm Algerian.
Algerian. Okay, so you're from Carthage. You're Carthaginian, right? Are you Muslim, or are you?
I'm secular.
Secular. Okay. Interesting, because I know in North Africa it's a little bit different. It's a little bit, you know. Somebody says, do you believe in the basic universal income? So universal basic income.
I think we have to be careful with that because it could very well turn into a subsidy for corporations. So if you have a universal basic income and everybody's getting some amount of money, there's a danger that that would be used to, for example, lower the minimum wage to zero, for example. People say, well, why do we need a minimum wage now if we have basic income? But what that would enable is for wages to fall essentially to zero. Like you could pay someone, 1 cent an hour, let's say, and because they're getting their basic income, it's not going to matter to them. So it could turn into a backhanded subsidy for big corporations in the same way that people complain about, Walmart workers today getting food stamps and getting all these benefits. And so Walmart can get away with paying them very low wages. I would be in favor of a program, say, to give people that are unemployed some form of assistance. And I think I don't have a problem with that. So it's just about making sure that it's not subsidizing the big corporations.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point because I think a lot of people think about it, and specifically conservatives think about the UBI on the labor side of it. They think, well, people are going to get lazy, people are going to leech off the system, and there would be no incentive to work. But I think very few people think about it in terms of on the corporate side of things, that you're right, in the way that Walmart functions, its business model is basically subsidized by the federal government because they can pay these outrageously low wages, have these low prices, because the government will be there to provide food stamps and all the rest. So another great point. I can't. Is there one issue, do you think, where you would clash with like the nationalist right, or are you basically, because you're hitting all the right notes here? I'm trying to. Is there one thing that you're a little off on there?
Well, I would like to bring up an issue with Trump's deportation policy, if you'd be okay with that.
Let's do it. Yeah, sure.
Sure. So I think a lot of people probably in your side of the political aisle would be very happy with that. But there are some statistics that I think people might not be aware of. So the total deportations, at least last year, for undocumented immigrants were about 0.74% of the population in this country. So it's really nothing, really. And it's actually down from an all-time high of about 2.1% of the undocumented population annually getting deported. So I do think that these deportations are, if not counterproductive, at least not effective at all in terms of solving the actual problem, which is the fact that we have so many people in this country. I would be much more interested in seeing the U.S. government really going after the employers of these illegal immigrants, because ultimately that's why people come here in the first place. It's because they expect a job. And in fact, a while ago, Trump did commute the sentence of an individual by the name of Shalom Rubashkin.
Yes, we talked about it on this show. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he was one of the biggest hires of illegal immigrants. And, it just seems to me that, Trump and the Republican Party in general has not taken the right approach to dealing with this problem. They should go after the corporations. They should go after big business. I think the focus on deportation might actually be very misplaced.
It's funny because, you scour to find something that we might find issue with, but that's something that actually me, and when I was in business with James Alsop, that's actually something we thought about a lot on our podcast Nationalist Review, because I think a lot of people on the far right, their mind is at the place of physical removal. And it's very one track. It's very simple. You have people, we have to take them and move them out. And I always used to say on this show, as a counter to that, in the same way that you did, go after the welfare, go after the jobs, eliminate the incentive for them to come and stay here, and that'll take care of a big part of the problem. So I think we're on the same page on that one as well. It's something that's not talked about enough, because you're right. The idea of deporting 13 million people is an enormous logistical and fiscal task. I mean, that's pretty enormous, and we're not doing very well with the few people that we are deporting. They come back. I mean, we don't even have a secure border, so it makes very little sense. But to get rid of those big swaths of people, it's probably more effective to attack the incentive. And we'll see if we have a couple more, and I think we'll call it at 7:40. Is that all right with you? Because we got to get onto our calls. Okay,
that's
so
okay.
Cool. We'll do. But I'd love to stay in touch. We could have you on frequently, because I think if you'd be fine with that. We'll talk after the show, but because you're a solid fellow. And we got John J, who says, how can we fight the left's monopoly on big tech?
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the right approach is through government regulation. Unfortunately, there are these companies and they are established, and because of network effects, there's probably not going to be another competitor to Facebook or YouTube or Google that's going to come and disrupt that market. So really, the only way to do that is through government regulation, and actually to appropriate progressive arguments against monopolies, antitrust law, that sort of thing. And I think the right way forward would be to treat these tech companies as public utilities. You can't turn off someone's water because they have a bad political opinion, let's say. And it should be the same thing with access to the internet, access to social media, that sort of thing. So I would take it in a more progressive direction and start using government regulation.
Yeah, makes sense to me. I see it in the same way. It's the public square. And that's another area too, like you were saying earlier about, I think you brought this up even earlier in the argument against conservatives' embrace of capitalism, where you see people like Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder, they will defend censorship on Twitter and Facebook effectively by saying, well, we're against it, but our hands are tied. It's the free market. First Amendment doesn't apply. And there's an area where it fails society. So highly consistent too. And we'll take one more, and then we'll call it a night. Oh, people are, and of course we are getting spammed. People asking about the JQ. do you know the JQ? I don't know if I want to ask you that, because I don't want to send you to Twitter jail or school jail. Don't want you to get expelled. But
I think I'll pass on that.
Yeah. Fair enough. I think that's another wise answer. And so I'll go back into my super chats and we'll see. Yeah. People are saying he's a college kid. Let's not ruin his life. Exactly. Simon Scola says, do you think Bernie would have won against Trump? That's a pretty good question.
I think it's possible that Trump would have had to go more populist if Bernie was in the race, but it's hard to say. I think with Trump's existing platform, it would have been hard, but maybe with Bernie in the race, we would have actually gotten universal health care and that sort of thing from Trump. Who knows?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a tough one to forecast, because who could say whether Bernie Sanders would be viable? I think that would be the biggest question: is can this wacky socialist type guy who purports to be something so different from the usual? But then again, Trump won, so I think it's a toss-up. But anyway, it's been great having you on. Thanks so much for taking the time, answering the questions, and really great to have you. I mean, you're a smart guy. Usually, people who are interested in politics like this and have these ideas, they're the autists, and they come on, and it's a little bit difficult. But you're articulate. You got the right answers. You're smart. You're courageous for standing toe-to-toe to Crowder. So we thank you for your service. You're a real trooper.
Thanks for that.
All right. Take it easy, big guy. Thanks for coming on.
See ya.
All right. Bye-bye. Great. Well, what an excellent interview. Wow. I am highly satisfied with that. Incredible, right? I mean, is that just me? And I don't mean to blow smoke. I don't mean to be over the top. I don't like when people are over the top, generally speaking, but we find this person on Steven Crowder, and he, comes out of nowhere. He just wanders out of the dark in Urbana-Champaign to completely blow out the capitalist shills for the whole world to see. And that's all it takes. And we get him on. It turns out so really great stuff. I'm going to have some competition. I shouldn't have even brought him on the show. Now I'm going to go out of business, right? But no, that was really special and great to have him on.